Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling something pretty intense. We've got a collection of historical sources, very critical ones.
Extremely critical, yeah.
And we're exploring their claims about the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. The claims are quite extraordinary.
They really are. We're not just talking about historical critiques. These sources lay out this dramatic central idea that the Jesuits are basically an organized, very secretive group.
Secretive.
Yeah, focused on achieving two massive goals, universal political power and a universal church.
Wow. Okay. And how do these sources say they pursued this?
Well, this is where it gets dark. The texts allege they used war, revolution, even assassination to get there.
So the sources we're looking at essentially frame them as a political machine, almost hidden inside a religious order.
Precisely. They constantly call the Jesuits the secret army of the papacy.
And that famous nickname for the Jesuit general, the Black Pope.
Right. Because of his supposed huge influence over the White Pope, it suggests this powerful kind of shadow leadership behind the scenes.
That name alone, Black Pope, really hints at the political weight these sources assign to the order.
Absolutely. And as evidence for the conflict this alleged agenda caused, the sources point to something pretty staggering. The claim that the Jesuits have been kicked out of more than 50 countries throughout history.
50.
Over 50. And these authors argue, look, this isn't random, it's proof of constant, unwanted political meddling.
Okay, so let's try to unpack where these sources say this all began, starting with the founder, Ignatius of Loyola. They don't paint a very flattering picture of his early life, do they?
Not at all. The descriptions are stark. His youth is called stormy, filled with heinous crimes. They label him treacherous, brutal, vindictive.
Not exactly the typical backstory you might expect.
No. And this background, according to these texts, sets up this really dramatic, almost violent conversion experience.
You mean after his injury?
Exactly. That leg injury during a siege, the sources claim the long, painful recovery led to a kind of nervous breakdown.
And that's when he turned towards mysticism.
Intensely so. But not just quiet reflection. The sources talk about specific visions he had.
Oh, like what?
Well, things like seeing the Holy Trinity as a musical instrument with 3 chords, or seeing Satan as this serpentine and shimmering shape, very vivid, very active experiences.
And this intense personal experience seems to have shaped the training method for the order.
That's the argument. It's all codified in the spiritual exercises. It's a small book, but the sources see it as the cortex, the real engine of the order.
And the process itself, how does it work?
It's about total immersion. Making the candidate relive the mystery with the greatest possible intensity, using all 5 senses, sight, smell, taste, touch.
Sounds exhausting.
Intense is the word. The sources are pretty blunt about it. They call the technique mirror-controlled autosuggestion.
Okay, but if the ultimate goal, according to these critics, is political power, how do these intense spiritual exercises serve that? What's the practical outcome?
Well, the alleged outcome, the real goal, is the total breaking of the candidate's personal will, their independent reasoning.
Breaking the will in just 30 days.
That's the claim. 30 days to turn the disciple into, and this is their phrase, a docile instrument, completely obedient, guided only by superiors.
So by erasing individual will, they create a perfectly controlled force.
That's the logic presented in these sources. A centrally controlled political weapon whose absolute obedience, they argue, made them the natural enemies of any kind of liberty.
Okay, so if the Jesuit is trained to be this docile instrument, how did the order ethically justify the actions this instrument might take, especially if those actions break normal moral rules?
Ah, yes. That leads us straight into the really explosive stuff about casuistry.
Casuistry.
This is the bridge. The sources claim the Jesuit mindset prioritized usefulness over, say, simple piety. They even cite a supposed maxim, something like,
Go on.
A clever carefulness together with a mediocre purity is better than a greater holiness coupled with a less perfect skillfulness.
So capability first. Skill over sanctity.
Basically, yeah. Because in this view, the ends justify the means. Skill gets the job done.
And that attitude, that focus on the end goal, allegedly opened the door for these doctrines of casuistry, sort of situational ethics, developed by people like Escobar, Sanchez.
Exactly. For listeners who might not know, casuistry, according to these critical sources, essentially provided moral loopholes. It justified actions that would otherwise be considered sinful.
How? What were the tools?
A key one was mental reservation or equivocation. The claim is these doctrines allowed a Jesuit to, well, swear falsely without technically committing a mortal sin.
How does that work?
By holding some unstated truth in your mind or using deliberately ambiguous words, it effectively turns lying for political advantage into something morally defensible, according to the critics.
Wow. And the sources give examples that show a real, hierarchy in morality too, right? Based on social status.
Yes, and these examples are quite jarring. The texts talk about doctrines that supposedly allowed killing under certain social conditions.
Such as?
For instance, the claim that a nobleman, if threatened with a public beating, could actually kill the person threatening him. But that same right was apparently denied to a commoner. The reasoning cited is that there's nothing dishonorable for a common man to receive a beating.
That's deeply disturbing. A moral code based purely on class.
It's chilling. And this idea allegedly extended even to violence against critics of the order.
To protect their reputation.
That's the most notorious claim, yes. That a monk or priest could allegedly kill someone who slandered him or the community. Because slander damages the order's political standing, its influence.
It all comes back to politics and power.
Always in this analysis. There's even a sort of darkly amusing nickname mentioned, the mammillary theologians.
Mammillary, why?
It apparently came from a Father Benzi's very specific, very lenient rulings about minor physical offenses against nuns. It just highlights, for these critics, their readiness to split hairs over any rule, no matter how small.
Okay, so if the doctrine supposedly allows killing a slanderer, how do the sources make the lead to claiming Jesuit involvement in, killing kings, a regicide, when rulers weren't cooperating with Rome?
The sources see it as a direct, if terrifying, extension of that core philosophy. Protect the order, advance the cause by any means.
And they name names.
They allege direct Jesuit involvement in the assassinations of Henry III and Henry IV of France, both kings who clashed with Catholic interests.
And they claim this was systematic.
Well, they go further. The texts claim that Jesuit schools actually included tyrannicidal texts in their exercises, teaching the justification for killing tyrants.
In schools.
That's the claim. Even suggesting, supposedly, that regarding the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, we made a big mistake. We should have bled the royal vein, meaning killed the king.
So the sources argue political subversion was literally part of the curriculum.
That's the picture they paint, yes.
All right, let's fast forward now. We move into the 20th century, and this is where the source material makes some of its most explosive connections, linking this alleged Jesuit methodology to the rise of totalitarianism in Europe.
Yeah, this is probably the most controversial part. The sources flat out claim that the Vatican and the Jesuits were a major force behind the rapid rise of Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco.
A major force.
Seeing them as war pawns manipulated by the Vatican, useful tools to achieve political aims.
And this desire for political wins allegedly fueled actual wars.
According to these texts, yes. They claim Pope Pius X actually encouraged Austria-Hungary to punish the Serbians before World War I.
Why?
Effectively seeing WWI as a religious war, an opportunity for Rome to triumph over Orthodox Russia.
Is there evidence cited for that?
They point to a report from the Bavarian charge d'affaires at the time, supposedly documenting the Pope agreeing that Serbia needed to be dealt with severely.
Okay. And this alleged political strategy, using conflicts and strongmen, continued into the era of fascism.
That's the argument. Fascism needed legitimacy on the world stage, and that's where, according to these sources, the Vatican stepped in again.
You mean the Concordo with the Nazi Germany?
Exactly. The 1933 Concordat between the Vatican and the Nazi Reich. The sources argue this was absolutely crucial for Hitler.
Why crucial?
Because it supposedly gave his regime international honorability, the seal of approval from the oldest international power, and maybe more importantly,
yes,
it allegedly helped neutralize Germany's powerful Catholic Center Party, removing organized Catholic political opposition, basically clearing the path for the Nazis.
Okay, that's the diplomatic side. What about the really extreme claim about direct Jesuit influence on the Nazi machine itself?
Well, the sources lean heavily on a statement, though its authenticity is debated, where Hitler apparently claimed he learned a lot from the Jesuit order.
Right.
Things about organization, discipline, psychological methods, but the core accusation goes much further than just influence.
Further how?
Alleging active support by priests for the absolute worst parts of the Nazi regime, including the Holocaust.
That's an incredibly serious charge. What specific details do the sources offer to back that up?
Well, they focus heavily on the case of Monsignor Tiso, a Jesuit priest who was the head of the Nazi puppet state in Slovakia.
And his role?
These texts accuse him directly of being, and this is their horrifying phrase, Auschwitz's first provider, facilitating deportations.
And that's not all.
No. The sources also go into graphic detail about the atrocities in Croatia committed by the Catholic Asasis,
Led by?
led by the Catholic minister Mile Budak, and allegedly supported by Archbishop Stepanek. The sources describe massacres, forced conversions of Orthodox Serbs.
And they present this as the ultimate outcome of that Jesuit drive for a universal church.
Yes, as the brutal reality of that political religious agenda in action, according to this specific critical perspective.
Before we get to the final big theme, let's just quickly touch on France again. The sources claim the Jesuits were deeply involved in the Dreyfus Affair, back around the turn of the 20th century.
Right, between 1894 and 1906. According to these writers, the Jesuits essentially orchestrated the whole anti-Dreyfus campaign.
Through the press.
Primarily through their influential newspaper, Le Croix. And the alleged goal wasn't just about Dreyfus.
What was it then?
They claim the Jesuits used the affair to try and strangle the laity in a redirected French Revolution, basically trying to roll back the democratic principles of 1789.
So even in a republic like France, the sources see this continuous political interference.
Exactly. It shows, in their view, that the political drive never stopped, regardless of the form of government.
Okay, so this whole narrative builds a picture of this relentless, militant political agenda. Which brings us to the final, really overarching theme in these sources, especially the ones written during the Cold War.
Yes.
Their claim that the Jesuits, and by extension the Vatican, fundamentally oppose any real, lasting international peace, any détente, especially between East and West back then.
This is maybe the most defining claim about their core political motivation as presented in these texts.
Opposition to peace itself.
The sources are stark. Their thesis is, the Vatican sees global harmony, global disarmament, as an existential threat to its own status as a world power.
An existential threat. Why?
They point to Cardinal Ottaviani's famous 1960 speech, where he condemned peaceful coexistence between nations as a crime of Cain.
Wow. Calling peace the crime of Cain. That's incredibly strong language.
Yeah.
Why would peace be seen as so dangerous?
The conclusion these sources draw is that the Vatican fears general disarmament because it would, quote, toll the knell of the Roman Church as a world power.
Meaning?
Meaning, if you remove conflict, if you remove the ability to influence governments through struggle to manipulate international tensions, then the orders and the papacy's political leverage just evaporates. Their usefulness to power diminishes.
So if we connect that all the way back,
Yeah.
the sources are essentially arguing that the core political existence of the Jesuits, and perhaps the Vatican itself, is fundamentally tied to global conflict.
That's the synthesis, yes. That's the end point of their argument. These sources don't see the Society of Jesus as just priests. They see them as this constant, militant, often ruthless political force aiming for total global control.
Linking everything from that initial psychological conditioning
Right, the breaking of the will.
through the moral justifications of casuistry for things like regicide.
And culminating in alleged support for 20th century totalitarian regimes and an opposition to peace itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
This has been a really intense deep dive into some extremely critical and provocative source material.
Mm-hmm.
We started with claims about training members to be docile instruments.
By breaking their will, yeah.
And then providing a moral framework, casuistry, to supposedly justify almost any action needed to gain power.
According to these specific sources.
Right, according to these sources. The question this material leaves us with, though, isn't just about history. It's about the present, maybe the future.
What's the question?
Well, if you accept the premise of these sources that a major world power perceives global harmony and disarmament as an existential threat to its very influence, what does that imply about how it operates politically? And maybe more pointedly, what methods might such a power turn to if the traditional tools of conflict, like big wars between states, start to fade away?
That's definitely something to think about long after we finish talking.